What if everything you built was taken from you? Hello, and welcome. Today's story is powerful, so leave a comment, drop a like, and let's begin. No one bends down to look a ghost in the eye. Elliot Monroe stood pressed between the granite wall of Vertice Inc. and the icy wind sweeping down Fifth Avenue, like a flaw in the skyline of glass and steel. He wore a stained gray overcoat, the collar pulled high to his ears, and a frayed beanie barely hiding his graying, unkempt hair. A shopping cart beside him carried 2 threadbare blankets, a torn backpack, and a book with a cracked spine. Around him, executives passed by, eyes fixed on their phones, coffees clenched in one hand, lives wrapped in quarterly goals. None of them knew. He had built the very company they now served. The air was thick with the layers of scent, diesel fumes from buses, citrus colognes of rushing employees, and the warm drift of fresh bagels from a corner stand. The city throbbed with noise, horns, footsteps, automatic doors, muffled voices trapped behind wireless headphones. But inside Elliot, there was only silence. A silence so deep, so old. It felt like dust covering memories too fragile to disturb. Every day he watched the cold rotation of the corporate world. He was a ghost with a permanent address on the sidewalk, almost always stationed beside Vertice's side entrance. That's where the chauffeurs dropped off the executives, where security guards mastered the art of not seeing him. Catherine Blake, vice president of marketing, walked past him every morning. Her heels struck the concrete like rhythmic insults. She never once looked down. She had the precision of someone trained to never acknowledge suffering. But Elliot saw everything. Every forced smile, every power-hungry glance, every silent cruelty wrapped in tailored suits. He knew this place because he had built it. And somewhere beneath the weight of filth and winter, the man he used to be was still watching, still waiting, still remembering. The storm began with a whisper, not a thunderclap. It started. One morning, the regular hum of routine cracked. Elliot noticed it in the eyes of the doorman, a flicker of tension, a sliver of doubt. A rumor had entered the building before sunrise. Something about a mysterious investor, an emergency board meeting, a change in ownership. He listened from the sidewalk as fragments of conversation slipped through automatic glass doors. Names aren't public yet. Never seen him before. Some kind of hostile buyout? Inside the marble lobby, sleek and imp. The power players wore smiles like armor, but Elliot could smell the fear, even through the cold wind and car exhaust. He hadn't come back to watch anymore. He was done being invisible. That afternoon, while the executives gathered in the top-floor boardroom, Elliot rose from his usual spot. He left the cart behind. Walked up, silence fell when 12 directors, in suits, some with confusion, some with disgust, and then recognition. It hit them, like a slow poison, the man not dead, not just watching, and now returning. The room held its breath, as if even the air feared him. Elliot stood in silence, coat wet from melted snow, boots scuffed and worn. Across the mahogany table, faces twisted in disbelief. Who let this man in? Someone demanded, but the voice trembled. It was Thomas Keene, now CEO, once Elliot's protege. Back when trust meant something. Elliot didn't flinch. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Pulled a folded document from inside his coat, laid it on the table like a verdict, a single sentence printed across the top. Transfer of majority ownership, Vertice Inc. Gasps cut through the silence, sharp as glass. Catherine Blake blinked twice, her perfect posture wilting. "No," she whispered. "That's not possible." But it was. Elliot had waited 10 years, watched from the gutter as his empire became hollow. He knew where the bodies were buried, who had buried them, and he knew exactly when to return, not for revenge, for truth. "For years," he said, voice raw from wind and silence. "You built a company on someone else's bones." They didn't deny it. Not yet. But beneath their polished fear, something else stirred. Memory, the scandal, the buyout, the rumors that Elliot Monroe had fled with guilt written across his face. But the truth was darker, and far from over. Elliot sat alone in the boardroom, long after the directors had scattered like roaches in light. The papers were signed, the truth still caged. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city pulsed like a machine with no conscience. He hadn't expected applause. He hadn't even expected understanding. But something inside him cracked, seeing their faces, the same faces that once toasted to his vision, now twisted in fear. He leaned back in the leather chair, the same chair they had ripped from him 10 years ago. Back then, Elliot Monroe was a rising star, the kind of man who built empires from sketches on napkins. Vertice began in a basement, cold pizza, scribbled whiteboards, a handful of dreamers, and when it grew, so did the wolves. He remembered Thomas Keene's first day, remembered offering him coffee from a chipped mug, remembered calling him the sharpest mind in the room. What a lie that turned out to be. Thomas was sharp, yes. Sharp enough to see that Elliot's generosity could be his weakness. Sharp enough to twist a false narrative. Sharp enough to take everything. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. They didn't just steal the company. They rewrote the story. Painted Elliot as the unstable genius who cracked under pressure. Investors pulled out. Partners fled. He lost everything, including himself. Elliot's reflection in the boardroom window was a ghost of who he once was. His eyes, tired, but burning. He could almost hear the echoes of that past, the endless board meetings, the celebrations, the smiles of investors who now turned their backs in fear. But he wasn't the same man. Not anymore. The years spent in the cold, on the streets, had stripped him bare. At first, the pain had consumed him. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to burn it all down. But that was before. Now he was patient, calculating. He had learned to survive. But more than that, he had learned to watch. He could see the cracks now. The cracks in Vertice. The cracks in Keene's polished facade. The cracks in the lies that had built this empire. And with every step he took toward the inevitable confrontation, Elliot felt something else stir inside him. Not just anger, but a hunger. A hunger for the truth. The truth about what happened to the company he built. The truth about the people who betrayed him. And, most of all, the truth about himself. It was time to pull back the curtain, to reveal the true face of Vertice. And the truth, Elliot knew, would be far uglier than anyone expected. But the more he stared at his reflection, the more he saw a man who was no longer afraid. Not of them, not of the truth, not of what he had become. The city lights flickered in the distance, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Elliot. He had one final meeting with the board. This time, there would be no surprises. no escaping the truth. Elliot knew how to play this game. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about exposing the rot, showing them who they really were. As he walked into the room, the tension was palpable. This was no longer about business. This was personal. Thomas Keene stood at the head of the table, his face a mask of confidence, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew what was coming. "You have no right to be here," Keene spat, voice laced with venom. "Right?" Elliot echoed, a dry laugh escaping his lips. "Right? You took everything from me. My company, my reputation, my life. And you want to talk about rights?" Keene's jaw clenched. "You're nothing but a ghost. You should have stayed dead." Elliot stepped forward, calm, controlled, but every word weighed like 1,000 pounds. "I wasn't dead," he said, his voice low and steady. "I was watching." He pulled out the file once more. The room fell silent. He laid the documents on the table, but this time, it wasn't a transfer of ownership. It was the truth, the scandal, the manipulation, the years of deception. The documents laid bare the deals that had destroyed him, deals orchestrated by Keene and the others. The truth they had buried so deep no one dared to speak of. No one but Elliot. And, as the room erupted in chaos, as Keene and the others scrambled to protect themselves, Elliot stood unmoving. Not out of pride, but because he had already won. This was the final piece. He had become the man they feared, the man who had been invisible. Until now. The walls of the boardroom felt like they were closing in, the air thick with fear and regret. Elliot had done what he came here to do. The truth was out, but there was no joy in it, only the quiet weight of what it cost. Thomas Keene, his once trusted ally, stood across from him, trembling, a far cry from the confident man who had taken everything Elliot had built. "You... Keene stammered, his voice breaking. "You were always one step ahead." Elliot's eyes were cold, not with hate, but with an unsettling calm. "I wasn't ahead. I was waiting," he said, his voice steady. "You and the others. You thought I was a ghost, a man lost in the streets. But I was never lost. I knew what you did." The truth burned, but it wasn't just Keene who felt it. The others in the room shifted uneasily, unable to look him in the eye. Elliot wasn't the man they remembered. He wasn't the man they had stolen from. He was someone else now. Someone who had rebuilt himself from nothing. They had made him invisible. But now, he was the one with the power. The tables had turned. He had come full circle, and with the truth laid bare, there was no escape. The room had fallen into an eerie silence, the weight of Elliot's words hanging in the air. Thomas Keene slumped in his chair, defeated, his empire crumbling before his eyes. Elliot's gaze never wavered. He had already won, but there was no sense of victory in his heart, only the deep, hollow echo of everything he had lost. It was over. The game had ended. And yet, as he stood there, he could feel something within him changing. The rage had burned itself out. The need for revenge, once all-consuming, was gone. What remained was a quiet acceptance. He had been broken, but now he was free. Free from the chains of his past. Free from the weight of the lies. And as the others scrambled to salvage what little was left of their crumbling world, Elliot turned and walked away. For the first time in years, he wasn't invisible. Not to them, not to anyone. He wasn't just a man who had rebuilt himself from nothing. He was someone who had learned to walk away from the wreckage and leave it behind. As Elliot walked out into the night, The city seemed different, not brighter, but quieter, as if the weight of the world had been lifted, just enough for him to breathe. The storm had passed, and in its wake, he was no longer the man who had been erased. He was the man who had reclaimed his own life, not with vengeance, not with rage, but with the quiet dignity of a man who knew who he was. And that was enough. The end, or perhaps just the beginning. Thanks for watching. If this story caught you by surprise, let me know below, and don't forget to hit that like. Until next time.